What if the first film ever made wasn't actually the first? That question might sound strange at first. After all, we have a date. We have names attached to that date. We have official records, institutional recognition, and more than a century of agreement. Most history books place the birth of cinema in 1895, and by 1896, moving pictures were being shown to paying audiences in multiple countries. The story seems complete. It feels settled. And for most people, it has never needed a second look. But certainty in history is rarely as solid as it first appears. The more closely something is examined, the more often small cracks begin to show. Not large breaks, not obvious errors, just quiet inconsistencies that don't fully disappear when you try to explain them away. And that is exactly what some researchers began to notice when they looked carefully at the earliest surviving films, the ones we are told were produced in 1896. Something felt slightly off. Not dramatically wrong, and not easy to dismiss either. Just inconsistent in ways that were difficult to ignore. Small details that didn't quite match the period. Technical qualities that raised quiet questions. Dates that, when placed next to the documented capabilities of the equipment at that time, didn't fully align. This is where the first doubt enters. But this is where it becomes particularly unusual. These doubts are not coming from the edges of the conversation. They are not fringe theories passed around outside serious research. Some of the questions being raised about these early films have come from film historians, professional archivists, and technical analysts who have spent years, in some cases decades, working directly with early cinema materials. These are not people who doubt easily or casually. When researchers at that level begin to raise quiet concerns, it deserves attention rather than dismissal. So the question at the center of this investigation is not whether early film existed. It clearly did. The technology was real. The screenings happened. The audiences were there. None of that is being challenged here. The question is something more specific and, in some ways, more difficult to answer. It is whether the timeline we have all accepted, the one printed in textbooks and repeated across generations, is as accurate and as complete as we have been told. Because if even small parts of that timeline are uncertain, then what we think we know about the very beginning of cinema may need to be looked at again. And that is exactly where this investigation begins. The official story is one that most people have heard in some form. In December 1895, two French brothers, Auguste and Louis Lumière, held what is now widely recognized as the first public film screening in history. The location was a basement room in Paris. The audience paid to enter, and what they watched was short, moving images of everyday life, workers leaving a factory, a train arriving at a station, waves on a beach. Simple subjects. But the effect on those early audiences was reportedly profound. By 1896, the Lumière brothers were sending operators across Europe and beyond, screening their films to new audiences in city after city. The technology spread quickly. The reaction was consistently one of amazement. And from that point forward, the story of cinema was considered to have officially begun. This explanation has been repeated for well over a century. It appears in school curricula, in film studies programs, in museum exhibits, and in documentary films about the history of moving images. It has been confirmed by so many sources, for so long, that questioning it can feel almost unreasonable. At first, it seems entirely normal. The evidence exists. The dates are recorded. The Lumières are real historical figures with documented lives and verified patents. The official version has never lacked support. But this is where it becomes unclear. When researchers begin examining the surviving films attributed to 1896, not just watching them casually, but analyzing them technically, certain characteristics appear that are difficult to fully explain within the official timeline. The frame rates in some of these films show a consistency that early hand-crank cameras struggled to produce. The exposure levels are more controlled than might be expected, and in several cases, the overall stability of the image suggests a level of technical refinement that, according to the documented history of the equipment itself, was not reliably achievable at that specific point in time. Early cameras were operated by hand. The cranking speed varied. The results were uneven. That is what the technical records of the period describe clearly and consistently. Yet some of the 1896 films don't fully reflect those limitations. And this raises questions that don't have simple answers. It doesn't mean these films were fabricated. It doesn't suggest the Lumières were dishonest or that the history of cinema is entirely wrong. It simply means that the gap between what the equipment could theoretically produce And what some of these films actually appear to show is wider than expected, wider than the official explanation currently accounts for. And that gap, however small it may seem, is worth examining carefully. To understand why these questions matter, it helps to step back and look at how film technology actually developed in the decades before 1896. The idea of capturing moving images was not new when the Lumières arrived. Inventors and photographers had been working toward it for years. In the 1870s, Edward Muybridge demonstrated that sequential photography could break motion into individual frames, a foundational concept for everything that followed. Then in the early 1890s, Thomas Edison's team developed the kinetoscope, a device that allowed one person at a time to view a short strip of moving images through a small peephole. It was limited. It was individual rather than shared. But it was real, documented, and widely recognized as a genuine step forward. These were verified milestones, each one building on the last in a way that made technical sense. The Lumière brothers entered this environment with something more ambitious. Their device, called the cinematograph, could both record film and project it onto a surface for a room full of people to watch together. That was a significant leap. And on the surface, the paper trail supporting their work appears solid. Patents exist with recorded dates. Personal letters from the period survive. Business records document their operations. For most researchers, this documentation has been enough to establish the timeline with confidence. At first, it seems entirely straightforward. Two skilled inventors building on existing technology and reaching a natural next step. But paper trails can have gaps. And this is where it becomes unclear. What receives far less attention is the speed at which the Lumières moved from their earliest internal experiments to a fully prepared public premiere. Between their first documented tests and the December 1895 screening in Paris, a considerable amount had to happen. Reliable film stock needed to be developed and produced consistently. The mechanism itself required refinement. Operators had to be trained to use the equipment correctly, and multiple films needed to be prepared, shot, and made ready for a paying audience. All of this, according to the available records, occurred within a surprisingly narrow period of time. Some historians have acknowledged this rapid progression without offering a detailed explanation for it. Others have accepted it as simply the outcome of talented people working under the competitive pressures of a fast-moving field. That explanation is reasonable, and it may well be correct, but it isn't the only possible way to read the timeline. And when a timeline moves unusually fast, with limited documentation covering the critical middle stages, it raises questions that a reasonable explanation alone doesn't fully close. This is where the details begin to complicate the official account in ways that are harder to set aside. When you place several of the films attributed to 1896 alongside films made just 1 or 2 years later, films produced with equipment that was documented as more advanced, something unexpected appears. The earlier films, in some cases, look technically comparable to the later ones. In a few instances, they even appear smoother. The image holds more steadily. The exposure feels more controlled. The overall quality does not reflect the gap in technology that should logically exist between those 2 points in time. And that is unusual enough to pause on. Technology follows a recognizable pattern. Early versions of any tool are rougher, less reliable, and harder to control. Later versions improve. That progression is consistent across almost every area of technical development in history. It is not a complicated expectation. It is simply how advancement works. So when that pattern appears to flatten, or in some cases revise, within a specific set of films from a specific period, it doesn't fully make sense. Some researchers have noted this without drawing firm conclusions. Others have pointed to it as one of several details that collectively make the 1896 films worth examining more carefully than they typically are. But this is where it becomes unclear in a second, separate way. The films themselves are only part of the question. There's also the matter of how they survived. Film stock from the 1890s was made from nitrate, a material that is highly flammable and degrades quickly, particularly without careful, controlled storage. The majority of films from this era did not survive at all. That is well established. Archives around the world hold only fragments of what was originally produced. Yet citing films from 1896, some of the most frequently referenced ones, exist today in physical condition that archivists have quietly described as better than expected for their supposed age. Not impossible, not proof of anything on its own, but notable, especially when placed alongside the other inconsistencies already present. And then there is a third layer. For some of these same films, the chain of custody is not fully documented. Who held the film in the decades after it was made, where it was stored, and when it was transferred into modern institutional archives? These details are, in several cases, incomplete or unclear. Each of these issues, taken alone, could be explained. Nitrate film sometimes survives unexpectedly well. Records from the 1890s were not carefully maintained. But when these inconsistencies cluster together around the same narrow period, they deserve more than a passing acknowledgement. One of the more specific issues in this investigation involves the documentation surrounding early public screenings, and what that documentation actually confirms. We know with reasonable certainty that the Lumière brothers held public film screenings in late 1895. Newspaper reports from that period reference the events. Ticket records exist. The screenings themselves are not in serious doubt, but what becomes considerably less clear is the precise dating of several individual films that are now officially described as belonging to the 1896 Lumière catalogue. And that distinction, between the screenings being real and the specific films being correctly dated, is an important one that often gets overlooked. Some researchers have examined the newspaper descriptions from those verified 1895 and early 1896 screenings and noticed something quietly uncomfortable. The written descriptions of what audiences reportedly watched don't always match cleanly with the content of the films now associated with those same events. In some cases, the descriptions are vague enough that they could reasonably refer to more than one film. But in other cases, they are specific enough to raise a careful question. Is the film that exists in archives today actually the same film that was shown to that particular audience on that particular recorded date? That question does not have a confirmed answer, and the fact that it remains open is itself worth noting. At first, the organizational problems of early cinema seem like a reasonable explanation. Film catalogs from this era were loosely maintained. Titles changed between countries. The same footage was sometimes distributed under completely different names depending on the market. Copies were made from copies, and the connection to an original became harder to trace with each generation. These were not unusual problems for the time. They were standard conditions in a new and rapidly expanding industry. So the mismatches between descriptions and surviving films could simply reflect that disorder rather than anything more significant. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult to fully accept. Working separately from one another, at least two film scholars have examined specific films from the 1896 catalogue and noted that certain visible production details, elements related to how the footage was actually captured, appear more consistent with filming techniques that were documented from 1898 or 1899, not 1896. Neither researcher made a strong or definitive claim. Both raised the observation carefully and without firm conclusion. But that careful, measured raising of a question, coming from professionals, independently, without a clear answer following it, is not something that can be easily set aside. It remains exactly where they left it, unanswered. At this point in the investigation, something larger begins to take shape. It is no longer about one isolated detail or a single unexplained observation. It is about several issues appearing together, consistently, centered on the same narrow period of film history. The technical quality of certain 1896 films that slightly exceeds what the equipment should have reliably produced. The preservation condition of specific reels that archivists have noted is better than the period would normally allow. The gaps in the chain of custody documentation that leave the history of certain films incomplete. The screening descriptions from verified events that don't match cleanly with the surviving films now attached to those dates. And the production details that some analysts have quietly placed closer to 1898 or 1899 than to 1896. Individually, each of these points has a possible explanation. Together, they begin to form something harder to dismiss. That is an important distinction. Any single inconsistency in historical records can be attributed to the ordinary complications of the past. Records from the 1890s were not carefully maintained by modern standards. Cataloging errors were common across the entire early film industry. Inventors of that era sometimes misdated their own work, either unintentionally or as a strategic move in a competitive environment where establishing priority carried real commercial value. None of those explanations are unreasonable. Each one, applied to a single problem, would likely be sufficient. But when the same category of problems, technical, preservational, documentary, and analytical, appears repeatedly around the same specific window of time, the accumulation itself becomes a question worth addressing directly. But this is where it becomes particularly unclear. This pattern does not appear evenly across all of early cinema. Films produced just a few years after 1896, even those made under similarly limited conditions, tend to have cleaner documentation, more predictable technical profiles, and preservation histories that are easier to trace and verify. The complications do not follow early cinema generally. They appear concentrated around 1896 specifically, and that concentration is difficult to fully explain through general record-keeping problems alone. So why that particular period? One explanation is straightforward. It was the earliest, and earliest records are always the most vulnerable to loss, error, and misattribution over time. That is reasonable and probably partially true, but it raises a follow-up question that has not been clearly answered. If the records surrounding 1896 are genuinely this uncertain enough for multiple researchers across different areas to independently flag concerns, then how confident can we actually be in the specific dates that have been assigned to these films? That question remains open. Not everyone who examines this evidence arrives at the same place. That is worth stating clearly, because this investigation is not built on a single interpretation. Researchers who have looked at the same films, the same records, and the same inconsistencies have reached genuinely different conclusions. And understanding where they differ is just as important as understanding where the doubts originally came from. Some believe the inconsistencies are simply the result of how early cinema developed and how imperfectly it has been studied across more than a century. They point out that nitrate film preservation has always been unpredictable. A reel can survive in surprisingly good condition due to nothing more than accidental storage circumstances, a cool basement, an undisturbed environment, a container that happened to seal well. No deliberate intervention required. They also argue that the Lumières were genuinely exceptional engineers, and that the technical quality visible in their earliest work is a reflection of real skill rather than evidence of anything inconsistent with the timeline. This position is fair. It is supported by reasonable evidence, and it represents the view held by a significant portion of film historians who have engaged seriously with these questions. Others disagree, not dramatically, but carefully. This second group does not claim that the films were faked or that dates were deliberately falsified. Instead, they raise a more measured concern about how the dating system for early cinema actually works. Their argument is that the dates assigned to many films from this period rely more heavily on secondary sources than is commonly acknowledged. Catalog entries, institutional records compiled years after the fact, interviews given long after the original events. These are not unreliable sources by nature, but they are removed from the moment of filming itself. And that distance, they suggest, introduces more uncertainty than the official timeline typically admits. In other words, some believe the date on a film may reflect when it entered a catalog or an archive, not when it was actually filmed. That is a quieter and more specific concern than outright fabrication, but it is also harder to definitively disprove. And this is where the explanation becomes most difficult to navigate. A smaller group of researchers goes one step further, suggesting that certain films now labeled as 1896 may have been produced somewhat later and assigned earlier dates, either through genuine cataloging error or through the competitive pressures of an industry where being first carried real commercial and historical value. None of these positions has been proven. None has been fully dismissed. They exist alongside the official account, unresolved and patient, like a question that has been noticed by many but answered clearly by none. So where does this investigation actually leave us? After examining the technical inconsistencies, the preservation questions, the documentation gaps, the mismatched screening descriptions, and the alternative views held by researchers working in this field, what can be said with confidence? Some things, certainly. We know that cinema began in the 1890s. We know the Lumière brothers were real people who built real technology and held real public screenings that genuinely amazed the audiences who attended them. The broad outline of film history is not in serious dispute. No serious researcher is arguing that moving pictures were invented at a completely different time or by entirely different people. The foundation holds. That much is clear. But the specific details sitting beneath that foundation are considerably less certain than most standard accounts suggest. The precise dates assigned to individual films, the exact identity of specific reels now labeled as 1896, the technical origins of footage that doesn't fully match the documented capabilities of the equipment at that time. These are not small decorative details at the edges of the history. They are the specific claims that give the official timeline its precision, and when examined carefully, they sit in a space of uncertainty that the official account rarely acknowledges. The inconsistencies noted throughout this investigation do not disappear under closer examination. If anything, they become more visible the more carefully the films and their records are studied. And this is where it becomes most difficult to simply move on. The technical questions raised by analysts remain unanswered. The gaps in documentation have not been filled by new discoveries. The researchers who carefully raised doubts about specific production details did not later retract those observations or replace them with clearer explanations. The questions were asked. They remain open. And perhaps the most honest position available is this: we do not fully know what we are watching when we watch these films. We know what the catalogs record. We know what the official timeline states. We know what has been repeated across a century of film history education. But the films themselves, examined frame by frame as physical objects with measurable technical characteristics, sometimes tell a story that is slightly different from the one attached to them in writing. Not completely different, not opposite, just slightly different. And in history, slightly different is rarely insignificant. The question of whether the first film was truly the first, whether 1896 means precisely what we have always been told it means, remains exactly where it began. Open, unresolved, and entirely worth continuing to ask.